This little bird is exceptionally brave. I'm standing right here. I'm gonna clip the camera on the... Unbelievable. Right here. Messing around with the camera. It is December 24, 2021. It's a lovely day. It's not very cold. I'm not even wearing gloves, so I can't take them off. Yesterday I tried to tell my story again, but I couldn't get past my preamble. It's wind still right now, so I'm just going to give it another try, and if some birds want to show up, ever the better. I first rolled into the sex industry in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, because I met a notorious sex worker, Shahar, and his common law partner at the time, and they still may be together. I can probably look that up. Cora Emmons. She was actually a celebrity on Dutch national TV as a sex guru, and he was a notorious figure in the Amsterdam nightlife, in the Amsterdam red light district. He was the very first gigolo, because was his main gig. He dabbled a little bit in porn. He did some live performances, I think in the Banana Bar, if I recall correctly. And I may or may not have participated in one of those shows. There's probably an NDA Shai is an American-born Israeli that came to Amsterdam, and a very interesting, colorful, multi-faceted man that I was pretty fascinated with. And we ended up lovers. I ended up being introduced to the concept of polyamory, where in consent of all participants, you have sexual relations with more than one partner, and everybody is either okay with it or trying to be okay with it. The operant word is transparency and consensus, or consensual. Consensual and consensus. That's probably words that are related to one another. So with Shai, I dabbled in the sex industry a little bit. I was butt naked on Dutch national TV in one of Cora's episodes, and it was all in all a very positive experience. I was introduced to many very interesting and deeply spiritual people, all sex workers, a bunch of wild, free renegades that I resonated with deeply. I was also kind of sort of dating my karate sensei teacher who operated his own dojo in Amsterdam, and he became sort of my pimp. He would drive me to gigs. I did a lot of private gigs, just stripping for a bachelor's party or some whatever executive wanted some entertainment for his business associates. At the time, I was still a police officer. So you imagine that my life was a little interesting. I was living multiple lives at the same time. And that eventually just had to come apart, which was part of a very deep spiritual awakening that was life-changing for me. We'll get there eventually. So Jelte would drive me to my gigs and hang around for my safety, and then would just take me home. A perfectly fine and consensual arrangement. So my experience in Amsterdam was a fairly good one, and an adventurous one, and one filled, obviously, with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I also experienced the underbelly of the sex industry. I don't necessarily recall exactly how Jelte and I ended up breaking up, but we did. And so now I was a free agent, which was maybe not the greatest for my safety. I ended up, through an agency, taking a gig in Reykjavik, Iceland. This was a gig to work in a strip joint as a pole dancer, both doing pole dances on stage for the general public, as well as trying to sell private lap dances, which would happen in kind of like little rooms, private, of course, because these were private lap dances, and customers would just buy a time slot with you, and you would just perform, especially for them, in an intimate setting where you could actually have a conversation and perform to their liking. There is a movie, I believe it's called Closer, with Julia Roberts, and I will attach some scenes to this video that can explain almost literally what I did. It's very, very recognizable. Very recognizable. So That was my job. I've done this before in clubs in the Netherlands. I was more of a free agent in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. One of the gigs I often did in Amsterdam was being kind of like the appetizer in swingers clubs. Swingers clubs are establishments, usually with a bar and then lounge areas, usually some private rooms, usually a facility like a spa with a sauna and a hot tub, a big hot tub, big saunas for many people. Maybe a swimming pool if you're lucky, a dance floor, whatever. It's a club, but it's a club for people that want to be naked with each other and that want to fuck each other's spouses or significant others. I was never into that shit. However, I was fine getting paid to do a striptease and a opening act to get everybody in the mood. The owners, operators of these establishments usually would love it if you would hang around and participate, which I never did, because I was in my 20s, and usually the clientele of these swingers clubs are, let's say, in their midlife crisis. So I personally wasn't into it, but I was happy to, walk home with a couple of $100 after doing the opening act. Snowblower didn't help my audio at all. So off I went to Iceland, and as if it was foreshadowing something, upon arrival I was immediately arrested. Sheerly because I was coming in from Amsterdam, I was in my 20s, and therefore I must certainly be carrying drugs. The police officers that arrested me wanted to frisk me and put their fingers inside of me to find the drugs that they were convinced I had stashed in there. And I was just out of luck because there was no female officer available to do it. So the guys had to go in. I refused because, well, I used to be a police officer and I knew my rights. So they dragged me to a local hospital and I was x-rayed. Surely because I was flying in from Amsterdam. That was their only, excuse to assume that I was carrying drugs in my vagina. And they wanted to stick their fingers in there to find it. Maybe this was foreshadowing the other trouble that I was about to get myself in. The club owner had sent his bouncers to pick me up from the airport. Hours and hours later, they finally got permission to pick me up at the hospital, or maybe they trucked me back to the police station. It's a bit of a blur. And in that bit of a blur, I was asked for my passport and my ticket to whatever excuse, verify my identity or keep it safe or whatever. The club took my passport and my ticket home. At that moment, I just wasn't... In that moment, I was simply not present enough to realize, like, whoa, wait, what? I was tired. I just had a very, very unpleasant experience where I felt that the officers were really acting out of integrity by even making me into a suspect based on nothing but the city from which I flew out of. It's like, what? It's not racial profiling, it's location profiling? Like, what the fuck? I was just flying in from Amsterdam. So for the first couple of weeks, I was doing my thing, trying to make the best of it, trying to make some friends, which turned out to be more complicated than I thought it should be. Upon arrival, I was warned by one of the other girls that if I were to develop a friendship with any of the girls, I needed to keep that hidden. Because if security, the bouncers, would discover that any type of relationship, any type of personal bond would be formed between the girls, they would take them apart and rehome them. There were several subdivision homes where the girls were kept. And kept is really the term that applies. We were dependent on the bouncers for everything. We were bussed in and out of the club. The homes where we were kept were far outside of Reykjavik, where things were happening. We were told that we were not allowed to speak with the neighbors. And of course, we were threatened with things like, you guys are illegal in the country. So if you speak to the neighbors and they find out, they will call the cops and you will be arrested. The girls were gaslit against one another. Rumors were spread about, oh, this girl is talking smack about this other girl behind her back, blah, blah, blah. Divide and conquer. So a couple of weeks into my employment, I was fined for some arbitrary offense that I had committed. I was fined for a considerable amount of money that I now had to work off for free. Which I, of course, refused because I know my rights. And I quit on the spot, or so I thought, because they refused to give me back my passport and my ticket back to Amsterdam. And in that moment, I realized that I was a victim of human trafficking. I don't know how many other girls were fined in a similar fashion and told not to tell anyone about it. Because as I explained, creating relationships was made very difficult. An atmosphere of competition was created in the club. Who was able to sell the most drinks? Who was the most desirable? Who was selling the most lap dances? And for who were the patrons coming back? And we were played against one another, gaslit against one another. And if you managed to create some sort of personal relationship with someone, they would split you up. was told that if I would go to the police with my story, that the club owner would declare that I was a prostitute, which was illegal in Iceland, and I would be arrested for it. I was also working on a tourist visa, so I would be in trouble there as well. Of course, all of this was sheer intimidation. But this is how intimidation works. If the intimidator can keep you disempowered, you buy into it. I found myself trapped in Reykjavik, Iceland, working as a sex slave, basically, and it wasn't as sexy as it sounds. For free, right? That's where the slave part comes in. Thank God I have a rescue story as well, obviously, because here I am telling my story and I lived to tell the story. Trust me, it's not hard to dump a body in Iceland. It's very rough. I did end up visiting like geysers and hot springs. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. But the vast majority is completely empty, and it's not hard to make an old hooker disappear, so to speak, once you are done with her services after God knows how many years. And of course, I hadn't told my family back in Amsterdam that I was going to be a stripper in Iceland, so nobody would know where to even look for me. And that's how human trafficking works. They prey on vulnerable, gullible people. Untraceable, and nobody's coming to look for them. My rescue story. There was a group of young Icelandic men that would frequent the club, likely because it was the only thing happening, because Reykjavik is not like Amsterdam or New York or even Toronto. It is, it's a city on an island. The patrons were mostly sailors coming through, business people maybe on a stopover or whatever. And then this group of young Icelandic men, somewhere, whatever, mid-20s to mid-30s. And I befriended them in a fairly genuine manner. And I befriended one in particular. And slowly, over time, I built a relationship with him. A relationship that became so genuine that he eventually asked me out on a date. He took me to his farm out in the country where he was keeping Icelandic ponies, fantastic breeds with many gaits and lush, wild mane and tail that I love. And we rode his ponies. It was magical, it was romantic, it was beautiful. I ended up spending the night with him. We had sex, consensual sex, as, two people. I was in my mid-20s, he was in his mid-30s. It was just a date with a happy ending. And I confided in him. He and the same group of friends ended up talking with the club owner. They never told me what their conversation looked like, or what was being discussed, or how it was being discussed. But the end result was that they came out of the club with my passport and my ticket back to Amsterdam. They got in touch with me. I don't even remember how, because we were, of course, kept in these homes with no phone, and this was pre-cell phone, plus we were all girls from abroad, so nobody had a cell phone. This was like more than 25 years ago. We were just basically isolated from the rest of the world. Somehow I was able to get them my location, address, whatever. Some of the details are very blurry because it was a exceptionally stressful time. Exceptionally stressful. And I was fighting for my life. So he and his friends came and fished me up out of the suburban home that I was kept. They gave me like 5 minutes to gather up my stuff. They had already booked my flight home to Amsterdam. We ended up taking some ecstasy, or DMT, a party drug that was very popular in those days, that was actually developed by, I think, a psychiatrist and used in therapeutic sessions, a drug used for healing of trauma. And I was taking it right after I was rescued by these guys out of a human trafficking, sex slavery situation. And here I was dancing on DMT. It was fantastic. And I did end up purging a lot of my story. I connected with yet another one of these guys, a different guy than the guy that I was riding the ponies with. And I was able to talk with him through my experience quite a bit, I remember, on DMT. So I was still coming down as I was touching down in Amsterdam. I survived this story because I created a personal relationship with one of the patrons of the club that kept me captive. This was obviously some sort of survival instinct that had kicked in. And over the last year and a half, this same survival instinct has been activated. And that is part of my story. This is such a brave little bird. Unbelievable.